Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, and today I'm speaking with Emily Hund, author of the book, The Influencer Industry, The Quest for Authenticity on Social Media. Emily, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for agreeing to be on our show. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
So I am a research affiliate at the Center on Digital Culture and Society at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication. I have been studying the influencer industry for the better part of a decade. Prior to beginning my research career, I actually worked in publishing. And that was when I started to sort of witness the rise of sort of early bloggers, early influencers, and started to have a lot of questions about what digital creators, what kind of impact they were going to have on our media environment. And those questions drove me to pursue a PhD on the topic, and then jumping off of my PhD research, I kind of dove right into extending that research into a book project, and here we are.
It is fascinating because the nature of your book is kind of an early history, maybe not the famous history 1.0 of journalism, but it's a bit more developed than that. And yet, as you point out at the beginning of your book, you in so many ways influence industry has a very large prehistory. I was wondering if you could perhaps explain a bit about that prehistory, to basically what are the antecedents of influence, and how can we think about influencing as something that has been with our culture and our society for really hundreds of years?
Yes. So the idea of influence has been something that philosophers and thinkers have considered for hundreds, if not thousands of years, really. And so it's always been a topic that has interested and captivated people. How are people influenced? Who is influential? Why are they influential? These sorts of things. And then, so when I started looking at this, I found that in the early 20th century is when we start to see a sort of shift from sort of more philosophical, I guess, musings about influence to influence becomes a subject of social scientific investigation. In the early 20th century, we have the birth of the advertising industry, and we have all of these things going on in the world, the rise of fascism in Europe and all these concerns about propaganda. So social scientists and sociology was a fairly new discipline at that time as well. And they start getting really interested in, okay, how do we isolate and analyze social influence? How is it that people how do they get influenced? And so there's this burgeoning field of research that just grows and develops, over the course of the 20th century, and eventually makes its way into marketing and then sort of mainstream conversations. And over time, these particular ideas about what it means to be an influential person sort of develop. And so there's this long history that I chart in the book of ideas of influence and how they've changed over time. And then we also have some other factors that come into play that again I get into in depth in the beginning of the book, but things like cultural factors like the rise of personal branding in the late 20th century, and technological factors, of course, not only social media, but even prior to that, just the birth of the internet and this whole idea that you can go online and self-publish, and there's this whole sort of technological history to people bringing influence online and developing this idea of digital influence. And then in the early 21st century, of course, we have the sort of the beginning of the demise of journalism and publishing industries really facing a lot of problems that change advertisers' behavior and have advertisers looking for digital outlets that will presumably give them more bang for their buck. And then sort of the last straw, as I look at it, is the recession in 2008, which sort of unmoored huge numbers of people from their jobs and from more traditionally planned career paths, if you will, against the backdrop of all this optimism about these new social media platforms and the internet, and this idea that you could go use these platforms to sort of like take control of your narrative and construct your personal brand online, maybe even get work, make some money, and this sort of thing. And so the recession really is the like the last straw, like I said, that drove so many people online, and then we see this rise of the digital influencer.
That for me was one of the real revelations of your book, was seeing just how pivotal the recession was. I mean, it was one of these things where in my mind I had this idea that there's this growing influencer industry, and there were these events that were taking place, at the same time, and I didn't really appreciate the sense of causation that you describe in your book. I was wondering if you could perhaps help us to understand exactly, when you're talking about an influencer industry, what distinguishes it from the sort of influence, marketing concepts, ideas, industry that existed prior to that period, and what were the parameters that you used in terms of you defining it when you were undertaking your research and writing your book?
Mm-hmm. So if you look at other industries that aim to influence, if you will, so I guess the closest corollary might be just like the traditional advertising industry that you might think of. Um, there are of course these other cultural industries that have a goal of sort of shaping our culture, influencing people to buy or to behave in particular ways. But what makes the influencer industry distinct, they do overlap, of course, and they work together. But what makes the influencer industry distinct is the fact that they are using influence as the sort of commodity that they're trading on. So they are literally trying to measure. And so, and I should preface this by saying that things have gotten much more, sophisticated now than than they were 10 to 15 years ago when this was starting out. But thinking back to those early days, they were literally, trying to measure individuals' influence online. There was this idea that like we can look at this person's followers or their various engagement metrics online, and we can literally say they are this influential, and we can assign a value to their influence, and then we can give it financial value as well, and say they are, and then an advertiser or a brand can say this person is worth this much to me. Their influence is worth X amount of money to me, and so that is what really got it going as its own sort of distinct industry. And then we see all these different uh, entrants to the field, who are all sort of they're sort of working together, and they're also sort of tussling over this idea of what influence is, how best to measure it, how do we shape it into a product that we can understand and sell.
That was one of the things I thought was most fascinating, was the idea of how you have this emerging industry, and as you describe later in the book, you see how the legacy industries that are associated with it are attempting to interpret it, harness it, understand it in various ways. But before we get to that, I want to get back to this early emergence. So could you Yeah, could you perhaps elaborate a bit on how exactly it looked as it emerged in the wake of the recession, the forms it took, and how exactly it came to become such an important dynamic in marketing and advertising in consumerism?
Sure. So prior to the recession, of course, bloggers had existed, and uh, people were using the internet to self-publish generally in various ways. But these numbers were pretty small, all in the grand scheme of things. And then in the wake of the recession, we have again, which kind of coincided with these different technological factors like the rise of, Blogger, which is like a software that makes it really easy for people without technical expertise to set up blogs for themselves. And then, of course, Twitter, YouTube, and then later Instagram. All these platforms are sort of just blossoming at that time. And so, um, when there was this sort of uh, unmooring, like I said, of so many people from their more traditional jobs. We see a lot of people start using these platforms, and with the hopes of managing their careers in some way. So something that really struck me throughout my research was how much every single person that I interviewed, and I'm talking so influencers of varying sizes, people with, small followings of a couple thousand up to millions of followers, as well as marketers that I interviewed, people who work for brands, talent managers, all these different people who are involved in the influencer industry in some way. Almost without fail, I every single interviewee, when I asked them to tell me, just their professional story, how they got to where they were, why, um, everyone would point back to the recession, and this was consistent across ages, and backgrounds, and again, like I said, the jobs that they're currently doing in the industry. It was consistent across all of these. Everyone looked back at that time and said, um, well, I was just starting out, and I got laid off, or I had been working for 20 years in PR, and I saw that PR was dying, and I needed to do something else, or all these different stories. But that was like the most strikingly consistent thread against across all of these interviews. And so people were, um, again, going to these platforms and saying, okay, I'm out of work, or I'm underemployed right now. I got to keep myself afloat somehow. I'm going to start posting. I'm going to start a blog. I'm going to start doing something to let the world know that, like, I'm still here. I still have expertise in my professional domain, and hopefully I can, like, either get some consulting work, or network with other people, or something, or at least just keep myself occupied while I am looking for work. Um, and so these early um, bloggers and influencers really, uh, they really were, for the most part, um, blogging about their expertise or things that they were passionate about. And so now that idea that, like, oh, we do what we love, and like we're passionate about this, now that has really, obviously taken on a life of its own, and we can get into that later. And I get into that later in the book about how that has sort of, that narrative has sort of run away and become a little problematic. But that early wave really was, for the most part, people just trying to figure something out to keep themselves afloat. And some of these people were ended up cultivating, big, sizable, or really loyal audiences um, with their posts. And so again, like several influencers who I interviewed, who were part of that sort of early wave of influencers, if you will, they too had really consistent stories of, I was just blogging or posting, or using Pinterest, whatever, to try to keep myself afloat, and then all of a sudden I realized I had this audience, and then before I know it, brands are contacting me, and I'm thinking, what, like, what's going on? You want to pay me? Um, and then, of course, given the economic circumstances, there, a lot of them said, yeah, what a great surprise. You want to pay me for this? Sure, of course. Um, and so that was kind of what it looked like in the early days. And like I said, there was also this crisis in print media, and so advertisers were looking online, like, where can I put my messages and make it really worth my while and achieve my aims. And so that's how they started looking at bloggers and things like that, and offering them deals. And so that's kind of how this started out, and it was very, you know everyone was just kind of figuring it out as they went along. um and then by a couple years in, say 2009, 2010, 2011, then we see, then it becomes more sort of well established. Okay, there are these digital influencers, brands are working with them, that is giving these influencers sort of like clout in various other cultural industries. At the time I was working in magazines, and so the fashion bloggers were obviously sort of front and center for us there, but these bloggers across sectors were starting to gain clout, and people were starting to say, okay, who are these people? Why are the brands paying so much attention to them? What's going on here? It seems like there's a lot of money changing hands, or is there? What's going on? And then we see this rise of sort of these influence marketing agencies who then start developing, like, just one is popping up every day, it seemed like at that time, offering services like, hey, we are going to help you make these deals, we're going to broker the deals between these digital influencers and brands, or we're going to just help the brands, like, pinpoint what influencers to work with, or we're going to offer large scale sort of like measurement services. Or so there's all these different uh, firms popping up under this sort of umbrella generally of influencer marketing agencies, and they're all trying to sort of find their niche and figure out how they can get a piece of the pie. And so that's when the industry really starts to expand in the early 2010s, and really starts seeking. First of all, it's growing just in size and in the number of people who are involved, in the amount of money that is being poured into it, and then it's kind of all these different groups. Then now we've got marketers, we've got brands, we've got influencers. They're all sort of trying to work together, but also look out for their own best interests, and also keep this thing going because it seems promising and seems fun. And so they're kind of starting to, the wheels of the industry are starting to really kick into gear then.
Yeah, that's it's so funny when you think about how it goes quickly from being something they do in their spare time to something that they have to put this enormous amount of cultivation into. And that was one of the things you talk about when you're describing the influence industry, is all the factors that have to come into play with that, how they have to think about maintaining, and this gets to the subtitle of your book, this sense of authenticity. They have to, it's great that they have this audience, but now they have to maintain it, because now it's their livelihood, and the challenges that poses for them.
Right. That changes the calculus, and it changes the stakes of their work too, a lot. And so, yeah, so that really was the reason that a lot of these early influencers audiences, went to them, as far as they can understand, as far as the influencers themselves can understand, and as they tell it, is their audiences looked at them as they were real, they were authentic, they were just people out here, starting blogs or YouTube channels or what have you, about things that they were really into. And so audiences were like, this is very refreshing. I enjoy getting my especially, in an industry like fashion, that's sort of, elitist, closed off, very, very hard to break into, very steeped in, privilege and things like that. All of a sudden, it's, there are these people who are offering like really smart commentary and seem much more accessible than like Vogue or something like that. And so, yeah, so that drew a lot of people to it in the beginning, but then of course then that becomes, your bread and butter. It's like they like you because you're authentic. Um and how do you maintain that? And then really then when we start to see this notion of authenticity sort of become detached, if you will, and sort of take on a life of its own, is when the industry, in that period when the industry was, powering up, if you will, um, and we have all these measurement tools and selection, tools for selecting influencers and things like that entering the space, because now they're trying to um, they're taking something that, this idea of authenticity, which, for pretty much throughout history, we think of authenticity as a social construction, something that is sort of, evaluated and agreed upon, in social groups, and then it kind of becomes this industrial construction, which, is something I argue in the book, that it's something that is sort of defined and given value by these players in the industry, and it's directly tied to commercial value.
One of the things you then go on to address is how, as it grows and becomes an industry, how it begins to draw a great deal of attention. How you discuss a few of the more spectacular controversies surrounding it. You address this interesting question. I must confess, I never really thought about it until I read your book, which is the notion of regulation. And then you also discuss how legacy companies tried or sought to you know adapt influencers in order to influencers in order to remain relevant. I was wondering if you could perhaps explain a bit about some of that backlash that influencers experienced in the 20 teens, and also how it was that in effect the broader marketing environment adapted to influencers.
Sure. So yeah, so up until, the mid 2010s, mid to late 2010s, if you will, that I think of that period as a period where the industry was really, you know just expanding, seeking efficiency, introducing all these new tools and processes, and also introducing, people were just flocking to the space, because we saw these sort of early influencers who seemed to be, um, you know having a great time and making all this money and all that. That was sort of like the public face of the industry. And so that sent so many people, even, online, to these platforms, especially, Instagram was just blossoming at that time. So there was just like this sort of glut of content, um, and um, and a lot of like aesthetic mimicry. So, people who, when it seemed like something worked, something got really popular on Instagram, a lot of people would sort of then try to mimic the look, to, find their own success. And for the most part, this was going on, and people saw it. Of course, regular users, you would encounter the content when you use social media, and people who worked in the industry obviously were aware of what was going on. But as far as broad public awareness of the influencer industry and where this content was coming from that we saw on our feeds, there wasn't a lot of like broad public awareness until, the mid to late 2010s, when, we had a few different things happen. So first, I think there was just like a growing shift that, has been written about a lot, about, just sort of a people were starting to get tired of that Instagrammy look because so many, an aesthetic had sort of like congealed around what influencers looked like, especially on Instagram. Really carefully curated, really posed. A lot of times almost looking like a catalog, from decades prior. And this still very much happens in the industry today, but at the time it was almost happening without much public critique, or not widespread, I guess, public criticism. And then some things started to happen. So the FTC started to get involved in the industry. And they famously sent out like warning letters to Kim Kardashian for not disclosing her partnership with a brand, and that was sort of like a public moment that public reprimand sort of started to bring it to people's attention that, oh, there's something more going on behind the scenes here. There were some other moments like the Asina O'Neill, who was like a huge influencer based in Australia. She had this, sort of public break with influencing, where she, posted these YouTube videos saying, this is all fake, this is all a lie, I'm miserable, all things like that. And then we had, Fire Festival. That was probably one of the biggest sort of public scandals related to the influencer industry, when we had these people who ended up being sort of charlatans, if you will, who had planned this, it was going to be like the best music festival in the entire world, and it's on this private island, and it's all very aspirational and elite, and they get all these influencers, really like high level influencers, like Kendall Jenner and the Bella Hadid, and all these sort of like super influencers who are also like models and did other things. They got all these sort of super influencers to promote this event. They sell all these tickets to get these people to this private island, and there's basically no festival. There's none of the luxury accommodations that were promised. It was just like this total public meltdown that was covered like across this sort of broad, media. And that really brought to public attention that like there is a lot more to this, sort of perfect looking content that that we see on Instagram. And there is a whole sort of, whole lot of other people involved, a whole machine going on behind this content, and that sort of that series of events, which they all happen, and there was more too, that I get into in the book, more events, but there was sort of like just like in quick succession in about 2015 to 2017 or 18, a series of events that really broke open into public perception that that there is a lot going on behind the scenes to this content that we see on our feeds.
And so you have and the Fry Festival it kind of is at a point where you're starting to see the maturation of the industry, and you're starting to see how because we talk about how we talk about dinosaurs out there in the economy, and the reality is that these dinosaurs are not going to see this gigantic meteor coming and shrug their shoulders and shuffle off to extinction. They're going to fight to survive, and it's one of the interesting parts of your story is how they do adapt to the existence of the influencer industry. So rather than being replaced by it, they harness it in ways that serve their interests.
Right. So in response to all of these issues, all the different, participants in the industry sort of adjust what they're doing to survive. And So we see a lot of, advertisers sort of taking public stands and saying, we're not going to work with any influencer that buys followers. We only want, people with authentic, there's that word again, authentic followings, authentic audiences. And we're going to institute all these new processes at the brand side to really ensure the health of their audiences, and ensure that we're only working with the most authentic and legitimate people. And marketers are introducing like ever more sophisticated tools, and people, some are saying, oh, we're going to start using artificial intelligence. We're going to start using all these new ever more sophisticated technologies to ensure again, like they often use the word like health or authenticity of our brand deals. And influencers, interesting, kind of take another approach, which is, okay, I'm going to stop pretending that my life is perfect, and I'm going to stop, doing all this superposed content, and I am going to start revealing a little bit more about like the behind the scenes of my work. And and then we start to see influencers start, sharing more, behind the scenes, sharing their messy houses, sharing their, and again, this is all, it's still constructed. I want, and that is what the book gets into in depth, is how this is all still sort of happening within the industrially set boundaries of acceptable forms of authenticity, and who can pull that off, and what does that actually look like. But that from a user point of view, you start seeing, people sort of sharing more. And this dovetailed nicely with like the launch of Instagram stories, for example. So again, we have these other factors, technological factors, cultural factors. There's always more going on behind the scenes that shapes the content that we see on our feeds. But this moment, was sort of a perfect match for the launch of Instagram stories. So people, started just getting on Instagram and talking while they, took a walk, or, made breakfast or whatever, and just got on and started talking directly to their audience. And that helped bolster their authenticity and sort of, cultivate this sense that, okay, yeah, I do work with brands. I do, have a personality online that I'm selling it, but I'm still a person, and I'm still doing the best I can, and I still want to do right by you, my audience. And so we see that type of content really start to blossom in the late 2010s.
Another dynamic that you see emerging during that period is the emergence of social consciousness. And that was something that I found to be especially relevant given all the criticism you see in the public discourse today about wokeism. And it struck me as I was reading that about how there's very much of a thread that you can take from that discussion today and tie it to how, as part of that image building, you see that desire for people to say, I have this consciousness and this conscience, and that I want to, and these are the values by which I stand, and how companies themselves were having to make that adjustment as well in order to present themselves as being part of this trend and connected and aware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this was already, there was a thread prior, kind of growing in the late 2010s as well, of like this sort of turn toward, quote unquote, socially conscious consumption. And so we see, the rise of a lot of brands, like I think I mentioned like Warby Parker in the book, like brands who are saying, oh, we are, selling products, but we're also trying to do good in the world. And things like that. And so there's sort of this turn toward people starting to start conversations, I guess, about being slightly more socially conscious in a way. And then, like I said, we already had um, this shift in helped along by technological changes, influencers getting on stories, um, talking more off the cuff, this kind of thing. And then, which really sort of set, uh, set the stage, I guess, if you will, for things to really change in 2020 and thereafter. With in the book, I look to like the sort of major earth-shaking news events of that year, with obviously the pandemic starting, the murder of George Floyd, and the ensuing protests, and then the presidential election in the United States that year. It was a very heightened and emotional time in our society, and influencers were they were kind of in this place where they had been trying to sort of cultivate their authenticity in a different way, and then there was these things going on in the world that were all like just too big to ignore, and um, so we see that like a sort of final shift, if you will, of influencers starting to finally address topics of inequality, politics, all of these more socially conscious subjects, which had been which they had kept themselves very distant from up to then. Um, and they're up until the late 2010s, there was pretty much an expectation that influencers be apolitical. You're supposed to just create beautiful content, don't talk about anything that can invite controversy. And this came from different corners of the industry as well. Influencers, will say that, brands didn't want them to talk about anything that could invite controversy, because they need to remain, they call it brand safe. They need to keep their feeds something that brands want to work with. And so they are sort of de-incentivized toward speaking their mind on social issues that they might care about. And they also were beholden, to their audiences, and experienced a fear of blowback if, they said something that, said something controversial. And so influencers were kind of in this, they had to toe a very delicate line, I guess. Between showing themselves as authentic, but not going too far, whatever that what might mean at the time. And so they had been pretty apolitical, and then and then things started to change, and we see a lot more influencers speaking out. We saw a lot more audiences too, sort of demanding of influencers, like, why are you silent? Like, what are you going to do about this?
Mm-hmm.
And so the industry had to sort of navigate this shift toward people generally wanting to talk about and address social and political issues, and also do something about it. Tell me what your brand is doing to address these issues.
We're describing an industry that is now 15 years old, roughly, and it's one at which we're starting to see some of the effects of it upon the people. You get into the cost of the influencer industry in your final chapter. I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate upon, what we've seen in terms of the price some people have paid for this, and how it is that influencers are responding to this growing awareness of what being an influencer can entail in terms of negative costs.
Yeah. So, um, I I I want to say that while the industry uh, I while the industry has sort of developed in these particular ways, and now we're in this moment, as I was describing, of like, people sharing more than ever, being, more integrated into, I guess, or, I guess, they are showing themselves as being, integrated in society in a way that they weren't before. They are still dealing with, you know the constraints on their work, and there are still, it's something that I get into in the final chapter, is how it has become clear that despite all of the changes and despite all the moves toward more alleged, authenticity and things like that, there the industry is still, it is not free from like the ills that plague our society more generally. And um, whether that be racial or inequalities, or gender inequalities, and all all sorts of all sorts of issues. It's not free from these problems, and in some cases it can perpetuate them. And so there are a variety of sort of costs, I guess, of the industry. And one, of course, which I think you were nodding to in your question, is the cost for the people who are working in it, which is the taxing nature of being an influencer, which is it's true. While I it's hard to to capture, it's hard to speak broad strokes about every influencer, because obviously there's a lot of variation in what people specialize in, and their how they earn their influence, and what they their ethical uh, or compasses, I guess. There's a lot of variation, but in general, it is a difficult thing to be an influencer, because you are sort of expected to share your whole self, and you're continually putting yourself up for backlash, whether it's from your audience or from brands, or just like weird things weird things happening. Like I had a lot of interviewees tell me about some like really frightening stories of being confronted in person about something, it usually something kind of low stakes, like you said that you were open with us, but like I it you just got married, so you hid your relationship from us. Like that was one story that someone told me, and people were like angry at her for not not being open with about the fact that she was in a relationship, and then she shared she got married, and like dealt with like some really sort of frightening attacks in the wake of that. And um, another interviewee shared how like she was contacted by a follower, who lived like thousands of miles away, who said that she saw her family photos, like the influencers' family photos. Someone had put them like in a house that was for sale, and like things like just a lot of strange, things can happen when you put yourself um, out there on like that, and especially under this guise of like I'm being authentic. It There's a lot of vulnerability that comes with that, and also something that we haven't gotten into yet, but I get into a lot in the book is the real imbalance of power between major social media companies um, and influencers and brands, and so both influencers and brands are kind of operating under these circumstances where they feel that everything can be taken away from them overnight um, if Meta decides they're going to change the algorithm or their terms of service or whatever. They could wake up tomorrow and their audience could be gone, or something could change, and this is all going to go away. So there is still very much like a sense of precarity in the industry that has been constant since its inception. And yeah, and so there are a lot of difficulties and inequalities within the industry itself. Then, of course, we go, take the longer view of the role of the influencer industry in, society, and we see even more impact. And so it's hard to get into on a podcast, but I spend a couple chapters on this, but yeah, something that is really at the top of my mind now is um, how this sort of the current sort of forms of authenticity, which is just go on there, be unscripted, lots of video, whether it's TikTok or Instagram Reels or what have you. Just get on there and talk, and just there's this idea. It's like, oh, I'm just sharing myself. I'm just being real. I'm just sharing my thoughts about XYZ, but that makes it so easy for unsavory actors, if you will, to insert themselves in here. And so in the book, I get into how political groups have sort of started to leverage influencers, and also leverage sort of the norms of influencing. So there's also sort of this bleed of influencer practices to all of us, and we're all sort of being incentivized and encouraged in various ways to behave more like influencers, and that invites even more possibilities misinformation to spread and things like that. And and so that is something that is top of mind for me right now.
Uh, well, we appreciate the time you've taken to spend with us. But before we go, could you let us know what you're working on now?
Sure. So I'm really focused on seeing this book through. It's something, like I said, I've been working on for really the better part of a decade. And so I'm really focused on seeing it through. But I think, what I just said about this sort of current version of everyone's an influencer, and how can different groups leverage that for their own ends, is what I'm turning my attention to for the next project.
Well, it sounds like an excellent follow-up, but I look forward to seeing when it comes out.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Emily. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.